I have mentioned loss and damage as a concept in many of my podcasts, but maybe it's time to actually create a separate podcast on loss and damage because it is an important concept, although it remains very contentious for various reasons. The most important one being that the rich countries uh, willing or accepting to pay for loss and damage may be seen as a liability admission that yes, we created climate change and that's why you are experiencing more harmful impacts of climate change. So they are balking at this idea of creating finance for loss and damage. Anyways, loss and damage is a general term used in UN climate negotiations to refer to the consequences of climate change that go beyond what people can adapt to, or when options exist but a community doesn't have the resources to access or utilize them. Loss and damage is and will continue to harm vulnerable communities the most, making addressing the issue a matter of climate justice. Addressing loss and damage is the crucial third pillar of climate action, helping people after they have experienced climate related impacts. Of course, you have mitigation and adaptation, and loss and damage is generally considered uh, something beyond adaptation and mitigation, so it's the third pillar of climate action. Further, from the World Resources Institute, one reason why loss and damage has been contentious is due to the concern from developed countries that compensating for losses and damages caused by adverse climate impacts may be construed as an admission of legal liability, triggering litigation and compensation claims on a major scale. As such, developed countries fought to include language in the Paris Agreement to prevent them from being legally on the hook for provide compensation. So, if Pakistan flood was considered increased in probability, scale, duration, amount of rain, so intensity, frequency, duration by climate change, and loss and damage makes it eligible for compensation, then rich countries may find themselves signing on to legal liability for what happened in Pakistan, and obviously they don't want to do it. But WRI also points to this schematic of Allied for Climate Transformation by 2025, which argues on how the global coordination should work in terms of the success at COP27. So you can start here: adaptation, enhance resources for implementing adaptation measures. So I'm recording this in October 2022 and COP27 is in November 2022 in Egypt. Ambition is to strengthen the policy action, and Paris Rulebook is to hold countries accountable. So that's the monitoring, reporting, verification part of the NDC's nationally determined contributions. Loss and damage sits here. Secure a dedicated new financial facility. How to bring about this is, of course, has been very tricky. And finance, scale up high quality finance to make Act 2025 possible. The Grantham Institute provides this schematic for for the various levels of loss and damage from this paper, Burns and Struminsky 2019. So at international level, you have loss and damage finance, knowledge development and sharing, oversight and monitoring, capacity building and advice giving, and international collaboration within and outside the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. There has been a Warsaw International Mechanism for particularly vulnerable countries in terms of loss and damage. I will show the timeline a little bit later on. So the Warsaw International Mechanism establish these principles: establish a loss and damage finance facility, scale up existing efforts and improve dissemination, work with global stock take and transparency framework, replicate climate technology center and network, and international convener. Okay, at regional level, the idea is to pool the risks. So you have hazard, exposure, uh, vulnerability, and now a response also has been added to the computing of risk. So you need to do the risk pooling. Cooperation and coordination, for example, on migration and displacement is needed, and knowledge sharing, of course, is always essential. That should lead to national level. So let's say you're in a continental level or a sub-region like the Indian subcontinent with Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and so on. Then to get to national level, you need integration of climate risk and information into policy making, national climate relief funds, risk transfer mechanism. So how do you deal with the risk in terms of taking actions, financial and otherwise, infrastructure, etc. Internal relocation arrangements, mainstream loss and damage across ministries. So you literally have health, agriculture, transportation, energy, and so on. Water, for example. So you have to work across ministries because there are always cascading impacts. Social protection programs and safety nets, and then it should down to local level result in capacity building, disaster preparedness, microfinance to deal with recovery and so on, and participatory governance. So everything has to include the stakeholders. So I'm going to take a little bit of material from Loss and Damage from Climate Change book, which looks at concepts, methods, and policy options by this group here. I think it's a Springer book, but you can look it up with the title. So evolution of the loss and damage discourse under UNFCCC here started in 2007 with the initial technical work. Consideration of means to address loss and damage was launched in COP 2016. COP16 at 2010. Work program on LND was established. In 2012, role of the Conference of Parties in addressing loss and damage was agreed to, and in 2013 Warsaw International Mechanism that we just looked at was accepted and its executive committee established. 2014 quickly followed up with a work plan and organization of the executive committee approval. And in 2015, Paris Agreement was adopted, of course, establishment of a clearinghouse for risk transfer and a task force on displacement mandated. 2016, Warsaw International Mechanism was reviewed. 2017, Fiji Clearinghouse Risk Transfer launched. 2018, Task Force recommendations for integrated approaches to avert, minimize, and address displacement. And in 2019, next review of the Warsaw International Mechanism happened, and of course this paper is a little old, but there have been progresses since as well. So to look at a few things that come under loss and damage, indicative list of measures for different categories of losses and damages. Note that listed measures are not exhaustive and that these measures could apply under both compensatory or distributive justice framings. So they have two categories: sudden onset extremes and low onset processes. These are insurable loss and damages, so you can insure for flood, crop insurance for drought or extreme rainfall, and so on and so forth. Slow onset processes are where the ecosystem is getting destroyed or rains are shifting, sea level is rising, and so on. So they are non-insurable loss and damage. So replaceable L&D, economic and some non-economic L&D. Measures A, risk transfer, so insurance, micro-insurance, insurance and risk pools, catastrophe bonds, and national and international disaster funds. Risk reduction with various things like early warning systems, which is my favorite, and of course preventive building measures and planned relocation, but this includes a lot of behavioral issues, people wanting to live near the coast independent of the risk and technology transfer. So under sudden onset, you also have non-replaceable L&D, loss and damage, and non-economic L&D. So these measures include recognition of loss accompanied by financial payments or not, active remembrance, example through museum exhibitions, school and curricula. So big disasters can be made into a display to provide people the active remembrance. Counseling, official apologies. Slow onset processes measure C and D include risk reduction, technology transfer, risk transfer via catastrophe bonds, redress, and rehabilitation. And measures D for non-replaceable L&D, these are for replaceable L&D, include alternative livelihood provision. You may get wiped out in terms of your business or your agriculture, desertification, and so on. Recognition of loss, active remembrance, counseling, and official apologies. Okay. There is also this idea of classifying loss and damage as avoided, unavoided, and unavoidable. So avoidable loss and damage that can and will be avoided by climate change mitigation and or adaptation measures. Avoidable loss and damage that will not be addressed by further mitigation and or adaptation measures, even though the avoidance would be possible. Financial, technical, and political constraints, as well as case-specific risk preferences, narrow down the adaptation space. For example, if a city like Mumbai gets projection of 1 meter sea level rise and it can only financially afford protection against 50 centimeters or 20 centimeters or whatever, there is unavoided losses that may be related to the loss and damage that comes with any sea level rise beyond what protection was planned for. Unavoidable include loss and damage that cannot be avoided through further mitigation or adaptation and or adaptation measures. For example, loss and damage due to slow onset processes that have kicked off already, such as sea level rise and extreme event risk, where no adaptation efforts would help preventing the physical impact. For example, in India, extreme rainfall, large-scale events, and large-scale flooding have increased slowly over time from something like 2 events per monsoon season to 6 events per monsoon season, and these are controlled from Arabian Sea warming, Middle East warming, Arctic warming, Southern Ocean impacts, and so on. So there are unavoidable loss and damage associated with that. In terms of a schematic for the spectrum of loss and damage, you can look at distance from adaptation and existing mechanisms, and the color scales here go from focusing on anthropogenic climate change to consideration of all climate related stressors. So we are going from more of an anthropogenic climate change here to here, but in the middle we have to consider all climate related stressors. What do these include? Adaptation and mitigation. All anthropogenic climate change impacts are potential loss and damage, and these can be dealt with through mitigation and adaptation. So these are avoidable, and here you have risk management. So loss and damage is an additional mechanism for integrated climate risk management. Limits to adaptation are always real and faced either by knowledge gap, financial gap, technological gap, and so on. So loss and damage here refers to climate related impacts beyond the limits of adaptation. And existential, so loss and damage is a debate about how to address harm done to vulnerable countries from anthropogenic climate change. This is the tricky part that the developed world is resisting in terms of admitting to loss and damage as additional harm caused by climate change that they are mostly responsible for. But does that somehow translate to accepting legal responsibility? This is tricky. So using an integrated assessment model, this book also provides some cost estimates for adaptation and residual costs for selected regions. So low damages and high discount rate. You can do this as high damages, low discount rate, or low damages, high discount rate. Discount rate we have discussed elsewhere in the climate change course, where we define it. Basically, it's how much the dollar today depreciates by what percentage into the future. The investment you make today, how quickly is it going to depreciate? So this is the simplest message to look at. So high discount rate basically says the investment you make depreciates very quickly, and it makes people think that it's not worth investing because future generations will do better and they will take care of themselves somehow. So this is tricky. High discount rate can be a very tricky thing. So adaptation costs for in billions of dollars for various regions like the Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, this is South Asia, China, East Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. So you are looking at costs over time increasing from as little as 5 to 705 by 2100 based on the scenario you choose for the warming rates and what result from those in terms of sea level rise, extreme events, cyclones, etc., etc. So you can see that for Sub-Saharan Africa it's low now. It was in 2020, but will increase to almost $200 billion. South Asia and China, you can see the numbers vary quite a bit, but the total adaptation cost for these countries is over $2,000 billion. Residual costs as percentage of adaptation costs, which correspond to loss and damage beyond the adaptation. Again, you can see that it can go from 306% and keep dropping to 66% because now the adaptation cost is high, but residual cost is low. Similarly for Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, China, you can see that all of them decrease in this case because adaptation cost goes up and residual cost as percentage of adaptation costs against loss and damage go down. I just wanted to put this here. You can read the paper for further details, because every time you make economic projections there are a lot of assumptions involved, the biggest one of course being the high discount rate, but in the integrated assessment models there are also tricky things like damage function and so on, which are also tricky in terms of the uncertainties they may produce in the projections, especially economic projections. Okay, so that's the loss and damage. Keep that in mind. Hopefully you can read it and then go back to some of the discussions where we have used this concept of loss and damage, like the Pakistan floods and so on. Okay.